Thank you all for joining today. I know we are about to embark on the holiday, so really appreciate you joining. I'm excited to chat with you all about some different ways that you can manage challenging behaviors in the school. I'm also excited to see that there are some parents on the call as well. I encourage you to check out some of the other webinar and echoes that we've done that are kind of similar to what we'll be talking about today. I definitely focus more so on schools and school-specific examples, but the different strategies that we'll be talking about today can really be applied across the lifespan, regardless of whether the folks you're serving have a disability or are neurotypically developing. So really, really great stuff. So here's just a cute little image of me traveling across the world to end up in the Midwest. But Raneem did a great intro, so I will skip through that. So for today, we're going to be discussing some behavior analytic strategies with an emphasis on function-based interventions to help support children who engage in challenging behaviors at school, whether that be minor disruptive behavior to more severe or intense forms of challenging behaviors as well, to help meet the needs of the students that you work with and their classmates and essentially everyone in the classroom. So specifically, we're going to be tackling these three main objectives today. So we'll review our behavior analytic strategies to support children. We'll learn how to actually implement some of these evidence-based practices within the classroom. And then I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing some ways that we can address common barriers to implementation. Throughout this presentation, I have a few kind of reflection questions and things that I'd like to pose to you all. So if at any point you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat or share some of your experiences as well. So one of the first kind of checks or reflection areas that I'd like to pose to you all today is I'd like for you to think about kind of some of these items that I've created on this checklist so that you can sort of reflect on them as we review the content in the next several slides that provide an overview of why challenging behavior occurs, how to address those challenging behaviors using behavior analytic strategies and function-based interventions. So a few things on here I'd like for you to think about as you're envisioning your classroom and the students that you work with. Does that student have an IEP currently in place? If they do, let's make sure that we're following it. I won't go too deep into IEPs. We have a wonderful presentation that is available on the KFSC YouTube page if you're interested in learning more about that topic. The other thing that I'd like for you to all consider are if there are any state regulations or any school district policies that are unique to the school district in which you're working in. So I tried to keep things on the Kansas and Missouri side, but very excited to see someone from Alabama, kind of close to where I grew up. So with that in mind, always important to be aware of any legal regulations that are in place, kind of across the different levels of government and your school district as well. The other question I have is, I'd like for you to think about, does the student engage in challenging behaviors? What do they look like? And are there any major safety concerns? And listed a few different examples of some different types of challenging behaviors that you might encounter. And I'd like, again, to kind of think through what are some resources that you have available at your disposal currently, in terms of conducting assessments and being able to develop function-based interventions based on that information. And then lastly, the feasibility and the capacity to implement these different strategies. That is one of the things that I hit home with all of the parents and caregivers who I train frequently, is that you can have a plan that sounds great in theory, but if it's not actually feasible, if it's not sustainable, then it isn't actually a good plan at all. So trying to figure out what is your current capacity, what resources do you have access to, so that you can work in a collaborative manner to address the needs of your students. So these are just some things I'd like for you to keep in mind as we kind of continue through the presentation. So before we go and dive a bit deeper into some of these behavior analytic strategies specifically for addressing challenging behaviors, I first want to make sure that we're all on the same page about why challenging behaviors occur. So one of the biggest things that we oftentimes encounter, especially in sort of the school setting, it can certainly be very, very frustrating. You may not have access to all of the resources that you need, and you may not be equipped with the tools to manage these different challenges as they pop up. Very easy to get burnt out. So it's important to take care of yourself and also pause and remember that regardless of whether or not this behavior is an appropriate or adaptive behavior, or if it's inappropriate or a challenging behavior, it's serving some purpose. And what I mean by that is it's a very effective way of communicating your wants and needs in a very, very efficient manner. So it boils down to some of these behaviors, although they may be frustrating at times, they are a means to an end for that student. It's a way for them to communicate those wants and needs. And some common reasons why they may be engaging in some of these behaviors are potentially to get access to something that they want, like attention, whether that be from the teachers, paras, service providers, peers as well. That gets a little bit tricky, especially as they get older. Peer attention is definitely a very big motivator. The other thing that they may be trying to get access to or trying to communicate that they want is access to preferred items or activities. They may also be engaging in some of these challenging behaviors to avoid or escape maybe something that they don't want to do or something that they don't like. Things like difficult tasks or instructions, non-preferred tasks, as well as non-preferred interactions too. So based on some of these common functions or reasons why challenging behavior occurs, that can inform the development of function-based strategies that can be used to support individual students in your classroom who may be engaging in challenging behaviors, and can be applied more globally to address class-wide behavioral concerns as well. So the two areas that we'll kind of focus on in terms of these behavior management strategies and function-based interventions is looking at preventative strategies as well as consequence-based strategies too. So on the prevention side of things, given what we know about challenging behaviors and some of the reasons why they occur, there are some antecedent or preventative strategies that we can use to address and prevent these challenging behaviors from occurring or from escalating into more severe or intense instances of challenging behavior. And again, I really want to emphasize here that with these different strategies, as we're talking through them, these can be applied not only at the individual level with a single student in your classroom, these can also be used with all students in your classroom, regardless of diagnoses, IEP, anything like that. These are good practices that you can implement at the class-wide level as well. So just to kind of hit on a few of these, it's important to provide high quality interactions and attention. what age group are the folks on the call? What age groups are you all working with, or what ages are your kids, if you don't mind sharing in the chat? You can feel free to write that in the chat. So depending on, thanks, Julie. Depending on the age group, the type of attention that you deliver is going to look a little bit different. So with like preschool age kids, they very much love adult attention. As they get older, like Julie indicated, middle school can be kind of hit or miss. They may not think that you are the coolest or want your attention. Gwendolyn, thanks so much for sharing. You working with all ages, which is fantastic. You kind of see the wide spectrum of types of interactions, different forms of attention that are preferred and appropriate given their age, setting, and things like that. Also thinking about providing access to high preferred items and activities. And I kind of want to put an asterisk with that because within the context of school, it may not always be feasible to, be watching your favorite movies on your iPad in the middle of class when you have other students trying to learn. So finding a middle ground, and we'll talk through some of those ways that you can implement these strategies too. Always going to be great to provide choices and promote some of that independence and autonomy using very simple and clear instructions, especially depending on your learner and their skill set. You may need to adapt how you're presenting those instructions. Setting clear rules and expectations, modifying tasks to make them more fun and engaging. And I by no means am a pro at that. I definitely go on Pinterest and take some inspiration from others who are far more creative than I am. So there are lots of really fun and free resources that can be accessed to. Providing help or prompting when needed, and offering and providing breaks as needed too. So these are just some preventative strategies that, again, we want to implement before that challenging behavior ever occurs. So I'm switching gears a little bit. On the bottom of the screen, kind of posed a question to you all. I'm curious to see if any of you have tried any of these strategies before in your classrooms or the schools that you work in, and if any of them worked or didn't work. So I'll leave that question on the screen for a minute, and feel free to respond in the chat. I'll have you kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and if you think of things, feel free to add them in. Oh, that's awesome, Gwendolyn. I'm excited to hear that choices have been something that's been very effective in your setting, as well as prompting. Absolutely. Have you tried any of the other strategies, or is it maybe that there are too many preventative strategies and it's hard to kind of implement all of those in addition to anything? Yep, you got it. That's awesome feedback. I'm also asking these questions because they'll tie in later when we talk through some of the barriers to implementing. Choices are great, but too many options and choice overload is very much a thing as well. So thanks so much, Gwendolyn, for sharing. So let's talk through some consequence-based strategies. So these are going to be ways that you can respond following challenging behavior. And based on kind of what we've chatted about so far, the two major things that I'd like for you to take away from this slide are that there are certain consequences that can increase appropriate or some of those alternative behaviors. And then there are also strategies that you can implement to decrease the likelihood of those challenging behaviors coming up again in the future. So we'll be talking through a lot of reinforcement-based strategies. One of our two terms on the right-hand side are differential reinforcement of other behavior and differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. So really trying to focus on reinforcement-based strategies so that we can increase some of these other alternative behaviors as well. And curious to see if anyone has heard of some of these strategies, has used them in the past, and what your experience has been. Julie, it looked like you shared that setting expectations was helpful as well as providing choices, which is awesome. I'm curious to see on the flip side, like once challenging behavior has occurred, how have folks typically responded? If you've seen any positive changes or if it's still been a little bit of a struggle. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna breeze through this part, but feel free to message if you think of something. So we've kind of briefly chatted through some of the strategies, but I'm sure you came to this presentation today because you want to know how to actually implement these strategies in the classroom so that you can better support individual students, groups of students, or the entire classroom as well. So these are a few general good practices to implement following challenging behavior. And Gwendolyn, thank you so much for adding that. I think that will maybe help as we're talking through this slide. Once challenging behavior has occurred, these are 3 good practices to follow. Of course, if there's a student in your class who already has a behavior support plan, so BSP or a BIP in place, make sure that you're following those recommendations and strategies as well. But these might help with all students and just things in general. So I like to think of it as the 3 R's. So refraining from commenting on the challenging behavior, redirecting to some other appropriate behavior, and the third one is reinforcing, providing rewards for engaging in an appropriate behavior or attempting to engage in that appropriate behavior. And Gwendolyn, I think what you're sharing is that sometimes it can be challenging to kind of stick it out whenever there's some attitude, but coming from the kiddo, or if it leads to these negative interactions between staff and the child. Does that kind of capture what you're sharing with us? Because I think one thing that may help in that situation in terms of decreasing some of those challenges as well as continuing to build rapport and maintain good relationships with, between the staff and the students is a lot of times, especially with like I'll use middle schoolers since Julie mentioned that she's working with middle school students, is they very much learn from their peers. They see that they can say certain things, and that gets their needs met, right? But oftentimes it's difficult for us as adults. We're humans at the end of the day, right? To not respond when we're faced with a student coming up to us and not following instructions or providing lots of attitude, and it can definitely cause some tension there. So it might be helpful for you to kind of work with that staff member on that first strategy of refraining from commenting on the behavior. So making sure that they're able to separate that it's not something that's personal. Although I've definitely worked with some middle schoolers that say things that you're like, man, that one stung a bit. So making sure that they're still separating that they are engaging in these behaviors for a reason, and it's not necessarily something that's personal. All right, so let's talk through a few more global classroom behavior management strategies. And I linked these two articles here. These are two of like my favorite articles. They're very quick and easy reads. I think that they're both maybe 3 pages total, but very, very user-friendly, and incorporated a lot of the information from these articles or these handouts into this presentation. So definitely encourage you to check those out. We'll share them after the presentation as well so that you can view them. But I really love the flipping the equation on challenging behavior one in particular, and I think that will really help kind of some of the different struggles that you've all been sharing in the chat so far. So here are some strategies that can be implemented with the entire classroom. So the first is what we call group contingencies. So the entire classroom. One type of group contingency is the good behavior game. You can also implement curricular revision or making modifications to the curriculum or the academic task presented. And the last one is pivot praise. So let's talk a little bit more about these group contingencies and how they might be useful for you across your different settings. So there are 3 different types of group contingencies, or ways in which you can apply consequences depending on kind of 2 things. Depends on which member's behavior count towards that consequence, and which members of the group actually receive the consequence. So let's take a closer look at each of these 3. So the first one is the independent group contingency. I like to think of this one as to each their own. So each individual's performance determines their own access to the reinforcer or that reinforcing consequence. So kind of think of an example here where each student in your classroom who earns an 80% or better on their math test gets to earn extra free time during class, getting to do a preferred, quiet activity. So that's a way that you can kind of incorporate some of those preventative strategies that we talked about earlier, but making sure that it fits in with your classroom and making sure that it's something that's feasible to do as well. It could also look like each student earning 4 check marks or tokens for engaging in maybe some pro-social or on-task behavior. And if they earn at least 4 of those check marks, then they can get a small reward. And you would be surprised, the rewards do not need to be expensive. At one point in time, we, in one of the classrooms that I was supervising, the students loved Post-its, different colored Post-its that you could buy like in bulk, which was great. And the duct tape that comes in different colors. So they would work to earn like little slivers of duct tape and Post-its. So this is where you can get creative and kind of see what is feasible, what resources you have accessible to you as well. So our second group contingency in the middle is the dependent contingency, or this kind of idea of one for all, or we call the hero contingency. So what I mean by that is that the performance of either one or more members of the group, so thinking of like the group as your classroom, that is what determines whether the reinforcer is delivered to the entire classroom. So the way that you implement this is you select a specific individual beforehand. So at the start of your lesson, there are lots of different ways that you can make the selection. I've seen some folks have like popsicle sticks in a jar with the student's initials, and so you can really have it be something at random where you're just picking a popsicle stick or, you know, a name out of a bowl. You could have it be somewhat random to make sure that the same peer isn't consistently always being the one who's chosen. So there are lots of different ways that you can make that selection, but the important part here is that you identify who that specific student is going to be beforehand. So at the start of the lesson, you pull a name out of a bowl, and that's the student who we're going to be focusing on. So if that student meets a certain criteria and behavior, some behavior that you've outlined, when you've given those rule reminders and those set expectations, if that one specific student meets that goal, then the entire classroom, the entire group earns access to that reinforcer. So what this could look like is, let's say that you have one specific student, Eloisa, and she earns four check marks for staying on task. Then because that 4 check marks was your goal and she met it, that means that the entire class now gets access to some small reward. And that can look like maybe extra free time in class. And the third one is the interdependent, and I made it bold so that it's not confused with the independent one. So with our interdependent group contingency, this is really an all or none type of arrangement. So you first determine the level of the group's performance or the classroom's performance, and you need to know that as part of your first requirement for the entire group to be able to access the reinforcer. So what that looks like is if all members of the group meet some criterion, some goal that you've determined, then that means that everyone in that group earns the reinforcer. So it's either everyone earns it or no one earns it. So kind of going back to that math example. So if like the average of all the students' scores in on like a math test or some math activity is 80% or better, then all of the students in the class would earn extra free time. So each individual member of that group, they have to meet that criterion. And if all of them as individuals meet that goal, then everyone gets access to it. So it's this all or none kind of situation. So I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking through this interdependent group contingency because there's a really great example and a kind of selfish, not so selfish plug here. Kind of a cool brag moment for the University of Kansas is the good behavior game was actually created at the University of Kansas. So Barish and Saunders, way back, they were the first to evaluate the use of the good behavior game, or GBG, in elementary classrooms. So this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. But there are lots of different ways that you can implement the good behavior game, and it even goes by different names depending on the age group that you're working with. Because there are definitely some kiddos who, if you call it the good behavior game, that's not going to be very fun. So there are lots of cool resources that I can share with you all based on kind of the age groups that you've shared. But essentially, it's the same interdependent group contingency that involves multiple components. So you can divide your class into different teams. You'll establish some rules, and then you'll provide feedback whenever there are rule violations. So let's say that one of your rules is remaining seated during your lesson. If someone stands up in a disruptive manner, obviously not if they're, standing up to go excuse themselves to use the restroom or something like that. But if they're just getting up in class and engaging in some disruptive behavior, that's where on this little whiteboard or a piece of paper, you could say, point for whatever the group is. They could have names with colors, they could have different team names, whatever works for your classroom. But that's how that feedback would look like for rule violations. You'd also want to make sure that you establish a criterion for winning the games. So in the example here, if they engage in rule violations, so if they have more points that go beyond the yellow line, then they wouldn't win. So they would need to keep any rule violations under that criterion. And then the other component is making sure that you deliver rewards for the winning teams. So what's great about the good behavior game is that there are so many ways that you can implement this using low-tech options, but there are also high-tech ways that you can implement this as well. So I really like providing this as a recommendation for teachers and educators, because you can really address some of those concerns with respect to feasibility and access to resources by having so many different ways that you can implement this. You can do it, on your blackboard or your chalkboard, a piece of paper, but there are also apps like Class Dojo that you can use it on, and each student can create their own avatar that they can see. So there are lots of different ways that you can apply this. I am curious to see if anyone has heard of this or has used something like this in the past. And you can do like a quick yes or no, or use like the hand raising function. Interesting. I'd be eager to see what you think, Gwendolyn, about how this may or may not work. Same for you, Julie. Be eager to hear a little bit more about kind of what challenges you're facing in your settings and how this could work, or maybe something similar to it could be useful for you too. Awesome. Okay. So with curricular revision, I'll just briefly touch on a few ways that you can make modifications to instructions and tasks. So depending on your classroom and your learner, there may be times where the task is it's simply too difficult or it's too effortful. And that's a great time when you can start to assess whether or not it would be beneficial to decrease some of the work that's required. I'm not suggesting that you make things so easy that then there's nothing for them to do or that they're not challenged, but there may be certain subject areas that are very difficult, and you may need to work your way up to whatever the kind of full workload would look like. May look like switching from an academic-based curriculum to a life skills curriculum or a vocational curriculum as well. And then we've talked through some of the other strategies in terms of providing choices and offering breaks, which sounds like a lot of you are already doing, and that those are successful strategies. The last thing I want to add to some of these revisions that you can make are modifications to the modality or the way in which the curriculum or the instructions are presented. So maybe a student or a few students in your classroom need for instructions to be written out. Maybe they need what we call enhanced written instructions that are very detailed written instructions that might include pictures, or again, depending on the resources accessible to you, it could be more interactive where there are maybe some videos linked to how they can complete the task as well. So including some of those visual prompts too. The last one I want to talk through is pivot praise. So this involves providing descriptive praise to peers who are in close proximity to others. For those of you who are fans of the show Friends, included just like a funny pivot image on there. But the reason why I included this on there is because within your classroom, if you're teaching a lesson and you have, two peers seated beside one another, one of them is on task, they're engaged, they're actively participating, they're asking questions, they're very clearly paying attention to the lesson. And then you have another student who maybe is not paying attention. They are giggling, they're trying to distract other peers. Maybe they are shouting, or you're seeing some early signs of this might escalate into property destruction where they're swiping materials off of the table. So again, thinking back to some of those consequence strategies that we talked about, that would not be the time when you would want to say, hey, Jamie, I need for you to stop shouting. Instead, we want to refrain from commenting on the behavior, which is a difficult thing to do. It's something that is kind of in our nature to react and to respond. I encourage you that when you feel that urge that you're like, oh, I'm about to say something, have that kind of serve as a cue to you to take a deep breath and scan the classrooms, like scan the room and see who is close to that peer who's doing something appropriate. And that's when I'd like for you to give them a shout out. So reinforce that appropriate behavior that the peer is engaging in. And this does two things. So first, it reinforces that appropriate behavior that the peer is engaging in. But secondly, it can also function as a rule to that peer who's engaging in that disruptive behavior, because you're essentially telling them, hey, this is exactly what you need to be doing right now. And when you do whatever this thing is, staying seated, working on an assignment quietly, then that's when you'll get access to my attention and things like that. So think of pivot praise as being really strategic in looking at who's in your classroom, who's in close proximity to one another, and delivering praise in maybe a different way than what you've done in the past. Let's talk through a few different barriers to implementation. And this is where I'd really love your feedback too, to see if some of the solutions that are offered are actually helpful. So there are lots of different barriers to implementation. This list by no means is exhaustive, but there's a performance diagnostic checklist that was created for human service industries that focuses on 4 common barriers. And within this questionnaire, what's really neat is that depending on how folks respond on this questionnaire, it actually provides you with solutions that are very easy to follow, links to all of the resources that you would need to be able to provide support for your staff or yourself if you want to kind of self-identify some barriers and some solutions to address those. So the 4 kind of common barriers are typically related to training, task clarification and prompting or reminders. The third one is a big one with resources, materials, and processes. And the last one is another biggie too, is performance consequences, the amount of effort involved, and competition. And what I mean by competition is that, like many of you have mentioned already in the chat, sometimes there's too much information. There are too many things that you might be able to do in a situation. And one, it might be difficult to know, when am I supposed to apply this strategy versus when am I not supposed to implement it? But on top of that, there might be other tasks that take higher priority. Um, and so it can leave you kind of in a jam where you're like, I would really love to be doing this, but I have to do this other thing first. So these are some of the common barriers. Um, do you feel like these barriers resonate with you? Would you add any additional ones that you've experienced? Feel free to respond in the chat. And I'll advance the slide just so you can see a few examples of um, some some barriers, just expanded a little bit on what some of the barriers with respect to training might look like, with task clarification. So it could be the case where there are so many different options and things that you need to do, so much that's expected of you in your already existing job role. And as you're learning to implement some of these different strategies and support students in your classrooms who may have varying needs, it may be beneficial to have a job aid present, just a quick cheat sheet that you can refer to that tells you how to implement the strategy, when to implement it, and when not to implement it. So that those are some barriers that are also tied along with training. So if you haven't received formal training, um, if no one has ensured that you know how to actually complete the task or implement the strategy accurately, that can certainly be problematic. Few other examples with resources, materials, and processes. I think all of us on this call feel the immense pressure that educators feel in the classrooms with not having adequate supports and adequate resources in place. And so I wanted to be very mindful of the solutions and strategies that I offered and giving you lots of different options within them of how to actually implement them with little to no materials or low cost materials or high tech materials if that's something that you want to try out. Because oftentimes you can attend a training and you're like, that sounds great. I have no way of doing that in my classroom or within my school district, which can absolutely pose barriers to you actually being able to try these strategies out. There could also be a lack of supervision and monitoring going on. So it's possible that you might already be doing these things, and it sounds like Julie and Gwendolyn, that you're already implementing some of these strategies and that they're very effective. But it could definitely be disheartening if there's no one else who is providing that feedback to you or monitoring your performance or seeing how students are responding to some of these changes too. And then like we talked about, some tasks might be higher priority and some of that might change day to day, hour by hour, minute to minute, if we're being honest. So definitely lots of barriers that can impede our ability to complete these things. But here are some different ways that we can address those barriers. So again, that resource that we'll share with you has step-by-step instructions of how to implement each of these different solutions and things like that. So I'll just give kind of a quick overview of that. So with respect to training, you can use behavioral skills training, which involves instructions, role play, rehearsal, feedback, modeling, and including all of those components into a very comprehensive training that's also based on your competency and having to demonstrate competency in that area. When it comes to task clarification and prompting, like we talked about earlier, having a checklist or a job aid may be beneficial. Maybe programming reminders in the location. So if you're trying to implement the good behavior game, for example, making sure that you have the materials that you need and that they're in the right place if you're using something that involves materials. With resources, materials, and processes, staffing is a major barrier that I think a lot of folks in various fields and workforces are experiencing. There might need to be some staffing adjustments made to be more supportive and to support you as educators in your communities. There might be changes that are needed for updating materials, processes, things like that. And then lastly, with our column over to the right, trying to identify ways that you can increase supervision and providing feedback to your staff, or maybe you yourself would like more feedback and supervision from others. Trying to highlight those task outcomes. So Gwendolyn, you were sharing earlier about staff having difficulty separating professional from personal and not taking their eye, off the prize when it comes to students engaging in challenging behavior and taking it personally. A great potential way to address that is when you see that staff member not engaging in those kind of personal statements of, I really don't like it when you do that. Why do you have to have an attitude with me? If you see them having a positive interaction with that student who if I can assume, I would be willing to bet that they are probably a student who frequently struggles with different situations, and they probably have some back and forth that's happened between them. So it would be great to highlight whenever that staff is having a positive interaction with that student, maintaining positive relationships with those students as well. And then lastly, finding out ways to decrease some of the effort or some of the potentially aversive aspects that come along with all of the responsibilities that we have. So now I'd like to kind of wrap up with providing a case example. This is kind of related to several students who I've kind of worked with in the past. But if you all have specific questions, please feel free to add those in the chat, or I think you will be able to unmute yourselves here shortly. But this example, I wanted to kind of bring everything together that we've talked about. So Maudi is an 11-year-old male who has been diagnosed with autism. He absolutely loves science and social studies or history periods, participates in class, but during these non-preferred subjects like math, he often engages in disruptive behavior. So protest statements, thank you so much, Gwendolyn. I appreciate your participation. So Maudi, during those non-preferred subjects, he'll sometimes try to distract peers. He'll, shout really loudly that he doesn't want to do it, try to get other classmates in on it, and try to set up a Lord of the Flies situation in the classroom. Might escalate into pushing or shoving, spitting at his para, particularly when the para tries to implement these strategies and tries to follow through. Now, another little tidbit is that Maudi does not currently have a behavior support plan. I should modify that. They do have an IEP because they have a para support in place. But I'm curious to see, kind of based on everything that we've chatted about today, what ideas do you have in terms of how Maudi can be supported, not only as an individual student, but how we can also support classmates as well, so that you can continue to do the math lesson, whatever the math activity is, because ultimately it's important that we address these behaviors at the individual level, but we oftentimes have classroom ratios that are very large as well. And we have to make sure that we're still actively engaging other students in the classroom. So I'm curious to see what ideas do you have? What strategies do you think might be helpful in this situation? And there really are no right or wrong answers. I'm just kind of curious to see what you think might work in that situation. I'll give you a few seconds to kind of ponder, and then I can help walk us through some solutions together. Right. So these are some of the ideas that I had. There's a lot of information on here, so I just want to highlight a few things. So the first part of the solution that I'm offering and asking you to kind of think about is decreasing Maudi's disruptive behavior and increasing some appropriate behaviors for him. So let's first tackle behavior at the individual level before we involve kind of those class-wide strategies. So first, always want to make sure if they have an IEP or a behavior support plan, a BSP or a BIP, that you're following that. For Maudi, it may be helpful to provide transition warnings or use visual cues of that upcoming activity. I think, Julie, you had shared that prompting, choices, and I think someone else shared that providing rules and expectations ahead of time is very successful. I think that would be a great thing to incorporate here. So provide, we call it transition warning. So when that social studies or that history lesson or the science lesson is wrapping up, giving him a warning of, hey, Maudi, in about 5 minutes, we're going to go ahead and start our history activity. Kind of giving them a little bit of a countdown so that they know how much time they have left with their preferred activity first. Now, when you get to, you've done all the transition warnings, that's great, but it's still kind of tricky. Here's where you can incorporate choices. So how does Maudi want to work on the math activity? So can they pick the order in which they complete things on a worksheet, or how the group work is completed? Can they choose the materials that they use? And then a big one is making sure that you're providing reinforcers, whether that be praise or small frequent breaks, whenever you're seeing that Maudi is attempting to engage with that non-preferred instruction. So we're not going for perfection. We're trying to get closer and closer to our end goal. So those are a few things that might work for Maudi at the individual level. But when we kind of zoom out a little bit more globally and think about how to support classmates, this is where I think using pivot praise would be really a really great strategy. Providing small reinforcers for peers in the classroom, and then trying to limit distractions within the classroom while still ensuring that Maudi is included. I know we had folks from a few different states on the call in attendance, so making sure that you're not inadvertently secluding or isolating Maudi from peers. So you can still kind of address things on the individual as well as at the group level. So